Hi guys, welcome back to the Adaptive Zone podcast. My name's Matthew Boyd. I'm a physiotherapist and running coach. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you're so inclined, share it with a friend. Today we're going to be talking with Steve Palladino all about running with power, which is an exciting topic and certainly is taking off recently, so I'm looking forward to that. If you enjoy the episode today, don't forget to check out my Running Fundamentals course. You can click the link in the description and you'll get one module each week. It's totally free. Now, over to Steve. Steve, welcome to the Adaptive Zone podcast.
Oh, thank you so much. It's an honor to be asked.
So, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your professional work?
I was a foot and ankle surgeon. I retired after 30 years of practice. Prior to that, I was a student and athlete. I ran for Adidas for a while. I had a 2:16 marathon PR back in 1979. After some injuries and stuff in my 40s, my late 40s, I switched over to cycling, which coincided with about the time that cycling with power really took off. So I've been involved with cycling with power since 2002, so over 20 years. After I retired, well, actually before I retired from my medical practice, I started doing coaching. Stride came out with a power meter in 2015, 2016. I started coaching exclusively by power starting in 2016. And this was also coincided with my retirement from medical practice. So
Right.
I've been doing that ever since, and have had the pleasure to work with a lot of really talented athletes, dedicated athletes, and really fun times.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, it sounds like you've had quite a busy career, from professional athlete to surgeon to coach, and now are you full-time coaching still?
Well, yeah, I would call it full-time coaching, although I'm doing it while I'm retired, so I'm doing retired things too,
Right.
But for me, it's interesting because every one of those things that you mentioned all sort of have ties together, and I apply one to the other. I use my experience as a runner to help manage and treat athletes, and the same thing with my coaching. Now I draw on my experience, but also my medical background in managing and preventing injuries. That's we all know consistency is number one in training and improving and running. And to be consistent, you have to dodge the injury. And you know that quite well with your background, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely my niche, my interest in trying to keep people from, the injury rates in running are catastrophically high, I would say, and trying to do what we can to minimize them and prevent them from, when they do come up, having such an impact on people. Right. Anything that we can do to do that is, worth looking into. I mean, one of the things I'm looking at Power for is, can it add some extra color to the picture of an athlete to try and help avoid things like injuries? Is there anything you can do on that respect? I think that's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, because what I'd like to do first, because I think for me, at first looking at power, it was, I understood how it worked basically with cycling, and then it started to come into running, and I was like, you would listen to podcasts about it, and it's a little different because there's some other variables to consider. And I was like, okay, it's a bit more of a complicated topic. So I wondered if we could just start from the beginning. So what is like running power? What are we measuring here?
Well, I don't want to make it too technical and lose all your listeners, but power is essentially it's watts, that you measure it in watts or normalize it to the weight of the athlete, watts per kilogram, and that's a work rate. Joules is the work, and it's joules per second is watts. So it's a work rate. Now, let's put that aside, and we can talk about how that's measured, in a follow-up question. But I like to simplify it for the runners. Power is another way of managing effort. So what do we have? We have perceived exertion, which, it's sort of like, I always say, that's the equipment we were born with. We have that on board. We don't have to go out and buy perceived exertion, although it does take some fine tuning over the years. But we have PE, perceived exertion. We have pace. We have heart rate, and we have power. Now there's others. There's muscle O2 and other ways, but those are the four primary ones for managing effort, and that's what power is. That's the crux of it. It's another way of managing your effort level.
Okay. And when you say we have heart rate, we have pace, and now we have power, how does power differ from heart rate and pace?
Okay, that's a great question, because a lot of people are so embedded with one of those two or both that, why do I need power? It differs. Power differs from pace in that pace is corrupted by wind, as we know. A headwind is, you're going to go slower at same effort than if you had a tailwind. So pace is I'm using the word corrupted, but it's impacted by wind and by grade. So, for example,
like
incline. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
So if I'll just use a quick example, if a coach were to tell an athlete, "Hey, I want you to go do 30-30s, 30 second on, 30 second off at 1,500 meter race pace," and you go to a track, piece of cake. If you're porting that to a hill and you're doing the same workout, what pace do you tell them? Well, power is portable in that sense, in that if, for example, 30-30s, the on part 1,500 meter race pace for that athlete, or race power, let's say is 300 watts. When they go to a 5%, 8% grade, it's still 300 watts. So, so the effort is portable. I mean, the power is portable, whether it's windy, whether it's hilly, whether it's flat. It's the same numbers. And I'll give you another quick example. If you're on a track and you say, "Okay, I want you to do let's say 2400s, mile and a half essentially, 2400s," and the athlete goes, "Okay, what are my splits?" Well, in pace, you got to figure out all these splits. Remember, splits for every quarter, every 400. Power, what's my split? Your split is 300 watts.
Right. Okay.
Your split is 300 watts at 400, at 800, 1200, so on. So that's how it differs from pace. So power is portable across wind, across grade.
Okay.
Heart rate. You want me to jump in there?
No. Can I jump in there on pace?
Yeah,
so let's say you were doing intervals, and let's say each loop of the, well, would you do it like I have so many questions, I don't know which one to ask first. So let's say you're going to do that interval workout, and instead of using pace, you're going to do like a hill workout, and you want it to be similar. So you would run up the hill for about the same amount of time. Let's say 5 minutes. Is that what? So you're running up the hill and you're holding 300 watts. So would that make it equivocal to the workout on the track in terms of effort? I think I kind of botched that question a little bit, but do you see what I'm getting at?
I understand your question. It is equivalent to what's on the track in terms of effort and metabolic stimulus. Mechanically, mechanically your running dynamics are different on the flat versus on the hill. So you're getting a little bit of different running dynamics, running form difference, whether you're on the hill or the flat. But metabolically, 5 times 5 minutes at 300 watts on the track is the same as 5 times 5 minutes at 300 watts on an incline. Now,
Okay.
I'm going to throw one caveat in here. For the mountain runners and trail runners that are listening, when you start getting into 15, 16, 20% grades where you're almost into power walking, running power sort of breaks down there, just the same as running power will break down in sand. Your reported power is not going to be quite a good measure of your effort, but neither is pace, and only heart rate might be a good surrogate for effort in running on sand. So for most normal running conditions runners encounter, yes, it's equivalent metabolic.
So let's say you had more like let's keep it nice and simple, and say you want to give a workout that's, let's say, an hour long, but the person is going to be running over undulating terrain. So it's not really steep grades where they'd have to power walk, but definitely they have to slow down. Things you might come across in cities and towns where you're just going up and down hills. And you might say hold 250 watts for an hour, and then on the uphill, they would end up slowing down, but they would still be looking at their watch and seeing 250. And on the downhill, they would end up running faster, but they would still look at their watch and see 250. So their effort would be relatively uniform, even though the terrain is going up and down. Is that the gist of it?
That's exactly the gist of it.
Okay.
And that particular part is counterintuitive to runners that have been running by pace and even by heart rate, in that you want to hold the constant pace, at least intuitively, and consequent to that, you're going too hard on uphill and too easy on the downhill. And the same thing with wind. If you're on the track, if you're headwind on one side of the track and tailwind on the other, it's the same concept.
Okay, so even, like, say you were running loops of a track and you were doing one lap, one direction, you're going into the wind. Let's say it's really windy. So you're working really hard and your pace is slow, but you might be like, okay, I'm still at 250 watts. Then you turn the corner, you're going back the other way, and you've got a tailwind. Now you're still holding 250 watts, but your actually pace is increased because the wind's helping you. But again, your effort will be uniform and the power is helping you adjust for the wind.
Yes, that's
okay.
Exactly the concept.
All right, that's cooler than I thought. That's kind of what I thought it would do, but I wasn't exactly sure. So then let's say that's I think explains well the relationship between power and pace and the differences between them. So if we come to heart rate, how does power differ from heart rate in terms of what it can tell us?
Well, in terms of executing training, there's two issues with heart rate. One is heart rate lag, which is a problem in interval training, higher intensity interval training, in that you start an interval at, say, a constant power, let's say 300 watts. Your heart rate's going to take a while for it to catch up and reach that target heart rate. So that's heart rate lag. And I need to get my heart rate up. So you may end up going a little bit too hard in the beginning of that and backing off towards the end because your heart rate's starting to drift a little bit. So in terms of executing interval training, power, I believe, is superior to heart rate because of the lack of heart rate lag. It's instant when you're instant in meaning less than 5 seconds. You put the your foot on the pedal, and within 5 seconds you're right there at your target power. And then there's heart rate drift, which can impact interval training, but also in your longer runs, because heart rate drift can occur over a set of intervals, so that, let's say you're doing five times 5 minutes. We'll just keep it consistent. That first one, you're going X pace, X power to hit that target heart rate. By the end, because the heart rate's drifting up, you're slowing down to make sure you're still at that target heart rate. Mm-hmm. So you're not quite getting the dose that you really want. In a longer run, you might get heart rate drift, such that heart rate continues to climb higher because of hydration or temperature. Temperatures increasing through the course of the run or the race, and hydration, dehydration ensues. Heart rate's responding to those. It's not simply responding to the metabolic demands. It's responding to hydration, heat dissipation, etc. So in terms of metabolic demand, power is the closest thing to metabolic demand.
Okay.
The closest measure to metabolic demand and your effort, really.
Okay. So I'm going to try and give you my understanding of what you said there and see if I'm on the right lines. So in the intervals, power is beneficial over heart rate because heart rate will lag. So when you increase your effort, it'll take 30 to 60 seconds to actually see a change in your heart rate that reflects your increase in effort. So it's not as useful particularly if your intervals are short, like less than a few minutes.
Right.
Because it's going to lag behind your actual changes, and it's not a useful target for a training workout. So that's where power, if my intervals are hold 400 watts for, I don't know if that's an appropriate value, but for 2 minutes.
It is for some, yeah.
and then you're gonna hold 100 watts for 2 minutes, and then repeat 5 times. As soon as I increase my pace, my power number will jump up.
Right.
And then that will make that a more accurate measure of the effort than heart rate, which would have a lag, as when I increase my pace, it would wait. But the benefit of power would mean that I could do this over undulating terrain, into a headwind, with a tailwind, and I would still be able to understand my actual effort and put it within my target effort. So is that about right for the intervals? That's where it benefits us.
Yes. Well, also, I touched on, in interval training, you also get heart rate drift over the sequence of intervals as well.
Right. Yes. So it's not just that you get heart rate drift over long runs where it'll slowly drift up the whole time. When you did those intervals, each peak in the heart rate would go higher than the last one, until by the end, your heart rate would be higher. So if you were using heart rate targets, you would actually have to slow down and put out less power to keep your heart rate in the target zone. Okay.
So, really, without going into it, what we're touching on is managing effort, but in the broader concept, we're managing dose. We're managing the dose that the athlete gets. So they're getting, if you're prescribing 5 times 5 minutes at 300 watts, we know they're getting 25 minutes at this power. So you're able to manage the overall dose quite well. Again, across hills and across wind conditions, etc.
Yeah, and if you used, let's say, a heart rate, and you said, okay, well, we got these 25 minutes in, let's say, zone 4. You might not, because if they had a tailwind or if they were going uphill or downhill, that could affect the actual effort and the dose that they were receiving of stimulus. It might be higher or lower, whereas if you measured their power, you would know the dose of power that they received as a stimulus.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Now, the other question I had about heart rate was like, let's say you took a longer run. So let's say your Sunday long run, you're going to go 2 hours. And I was chatting with Tyler about this last week. And across those 2 hours, your heart rate is going to drift steadily upwards. And then you've got two choices. If you've got a heart rate target zone, you can slow down or you can let it go up out of the zone. But what you're saying with power, I think, is you could have a power target. Let's say your zone 2, just to keep it simple for now, is 150. I don't know if that's reasonable, but that's what I'll say. You could say, I'm going to keep 150 for 2 hours. And then you can ignore your heart rate and pace, but you know that your dose of power was 150 for 2 hours. And then you wouldn't have to worry about where your heart rate was. Is that right?
That's correct. And it's hard to describe these things without visuals, so to
Yes.
speak. But I mean, I've had athletes that have run big PRs in a marathon, and their power is just this flat line, meaning constant power through the whole marathon. It just nails it. But their heart rate tracing is just going up, 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 up. And if that athlete was given, you need to hit this heart rate, stay in this band, you might see them overexerting early and then later on slowing down to make sure, because of heart rate drift. And again, people will say, well, heart rate is giving you the body's response to metabolic demand. Yes, but it's also responding to dehydration, to the temperature between the start of the marathon at 8 a.m. and the finish of the marathon at 11 a.m. As the temperature increases, that's also going to increase the heart rate as well, because of managing heat dissipation. So the thing with the main difference with power is that it allows you to peg that metabolic demand pretty well.
So you can tell me if I'm thinking about this correctly, because I was trying to wrap my head around how power differs from heart rate. And like you said, your heart rate tells you how hard your body is working, kind of. But the thing I thought maybe about power is when you sprint, right? I can imagine if I was wearing a power meter on my shoe and I just did 100 meters sprint from a stop, I just sprinted, I would immediately see a change in my power output. And that would be reflective of my pace, which went from very slow to extremely fast very quickly. And it also would be a reasonably good proxy of what is happening in the muscles, because the muscles aren't going to go, this guy wants to run faster, tell the heart to speed up. They're just going to contract as hard, as fast as they can. And they're going to use whatever's around, like phosphagen or whatever, and just make it happen. And then they'll be like, heart rate, we need some more stuff. So there's this kind of, your heart rate isn't really measuring what your muscles are doing. It's measuring the response of the body to what the muscles already did. So I was wondering, is power more giving us a reflection of what is happening in the muscles to produce the movement? Is that right?
I would say that's a accurate statement. And what you said, heart rate is a response. So one is what's producing the movement and what's responding to that demand, and responding besides that demand it's responding to other things as well.
So let's say I did that 100-meter sprint again, but like a sled that the football players push with let's say 300 pounds on it. So I'm pushing it I'm putting just as much effort in, but I'm not moving very fast because of all the weight I'm trying to push, or I'm trying to jumpstart a car or whatever, What would my power numbers say in those instances?
That you just touched on an area where running power is way more nuanced than cycling power. So if let's say you had a bicycle attached to that weight, and you're pushing a bicycle, your power is going to go right up. But running power is the watts reported is dependent on the weight setting. So the power meter is reporting based on you as a 70 kilogram
Right.
athlete, when really the mass that you're pushing is more than 70 kilograms in that particular instant. If we're talking about carrying water bottles and the water bottles go away, etc., that's not a big deal. But if we're talking about a weight sled or pushing a baby stroller with a couple with twins in it, power breaks down.
Okay.
It's nuanced, but there's ways of working around. I mean, as a coach, I know how to manage that, and I know what to tell the athlete to do to manage that by adjusting their weight setting on their pod. But no, you just touched on one of the nuanced areas of run power that's different, makes it different than cycling power.
Yeah, that's interesting because that's a good point. I wouldn't have thought of that. So if you are running with power, you need to continuously update your weight setting at a regular interval, because if you lose weight through certain parts of the year and gain weight at other, or you lose a bunch of weight over 2 or 3 year period, your power metrics will go awry if you don't have accurate weight set in your app, I presume.
I'm going to answer no.
Okay.
Because number one, I'm going to use Stride as an example, because that's the pod that the athletes that I coach typically use. The weight setting doesn't matter in terms of watts per kilogram. The accelerometers, the gyroscope, barometer, etc., goes that sensor data goes into Stride's algorithm, which computes power in watts per kilogram. So that's always right. The pod is always producing watts per kilogram accurately, regardless of what your weight setting is. Doesn't matter. The weight setting, the whole idea of the weight setting is so it gives you a 3-integer number, 100 or 250. It gives it's a multiplier. The weight setting multiplies the native calculated watts per kilogram, which are always right, and it's a multiplier that allows a watch to report, because watches and such don't report. Now they do a little bit, but when it originated, the conform was 3-digit integer for reporting power. So the weight is merely the weight is a multiplier. Now let me do one. I'm going to interject one more reason.
Yeah.
Watts per kilogram, all these are the same. And power is meaningless unless it's related to something. I'm going to use pace as an example. I just ran 5 miles at 5-minute pace. What does that mean? You have to relate it to something. This is this Eliud Kipchoge?
Mm-hmm. So is that easy? Is that hard? Is that medium?
Exactly. Yeah. So if you are creating an anchor, a reference point, say critical power, which is a concept we can discuss perhaps. Everything, all your training intensities and stuff are anchored to critical power and a few other things. So if this was done at one weight setting, and suddenly you're changing weight setting down here, but still referencing this, your watts are going to be not relatable. Mm-hmm. So it's for me. I tell my athletes, set it and forget it. Don't change your weight setting, because what is changing if your body weight changes, watts per kilogram are still being reported accurately. They're always correct. But what changes over time is your anchor point. Just like, hey, my threshold pace might change as I get more fit. Critical power might change, but you want everything to relate to that current value. I tell my athletes, never change your weight setting. I'll do all the maths on my side.
Okay.
And
Okay.
it makes it really easy for me to, you're doing 100 to 103% of critical power in these intervals today. That's it.
I think that's a good time to talk a little bit about, if you could explain what you mean by critical power, and then how people might, because we did say, you could do these types of workouts and stuff. And I think a lot of people, especially those who listen to this show, will be familiar with different training zones, and there's different zone-based systems. But how might someone use a power meter, and we'll get to what type of power meters there are available in a second.
Sure.
But how might someone take the information on a power meter, so it's telling them, you're running along at 200 watts or whatever, and actually make some sort of useful workout out of that?
Yes. So most athletes that are using power use critical power or functional threshold power. Essentially, conceptually, they're the same thing. They use critical power. Critical power is the sort of the marker that separates the heavy domain and severe domain. Or, if you're a follower of Steven Seiler and 80-20, that marker between heavy and severe is the distinction between zone 2 and zone 3 in a 3-zone system like Seiler uses or is described. Mm-hmm. So critical power has been around for about, the concept was developed about 60 years ago, a little over 60 years ago. So it's been around for a long time. It's commonly researched. It is as close to your metabolic steady state as you can get. And the beauty of it, if you have a running power meter, you don't have to go to a lab. You can assess what your critical power is. You could do it every 4 weeks, every 8 weeks, every 3 months, but you can always get that value, and then all of your training targets or training zones are run off of that anchor point.
Okay. And then how would you do that? Let's say do you know your critical power off the top of your head?
I don't run anymore. I know what my cycling is, but for an athlete, I'll just use a hypothetical athlete that I coach. So let's say I have an athlete whose critical power is 370 watts. In fact, I've got a guy who's running a marathon next week. He's hopefully going to get an Olympic trials qualifying time. He's about 375 watts is his critical power, which for him, I'm just off the top of my head, it's around 5.4, 5.5 watts per kilogram. Put that in reference terms for the listeners. Eliud Kipchoge probably estimated a critical power around 6.0 to 6.2 watts per kilogram.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay.
So, okay. Do you have a follow-up question? So that's basically the critical power.
I'm just just the wheels are turning.
Okay, so
that's the face I make when I'm thinking.
Let me give a way for your listeners to sort of relate to this. If let's say you're a coach says, "Hey, I want you to do 5 times mile at a cruise interval pace for Daniels, or 5 times a mile at 15K race pace. For me, I could prescribe that same workout. I might prescribe 5 times 5 minutes at 99 to 101% of critical power.
Right. Okay.
I use an anchor point, a Daniels anchor point as one example. I use your race pace as another anchor point. In this case, I'm using critical power because it's a really nice definition of that maximal metabolic steady state and the junction or the marker between heavy and severe intensity domains.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now let's say, so he's got a 370 watts critical power, and you want him to do, let's say, a workout that is going to develop his VO2 max, let's say. How would you then develop, could you give us an example of a workout that might do that?
Okay, so forget that 375 for a moment. Let's just use percentages of critical power.
Okay.
I would have him, I might have him do a workout of 6 to 8 times 4 minutes at 108 to 112% of critical power, which is about 5K to 3K race power. So that would get him a pretty good, close to VO2 max type of workout. Let's just say six times 4 minutes at 108 to 112% for that particular athlete.
Mm-hmm. So then he would, on his watch or whatever, see the target power. I can't do the math, but let's say it's like 415. And he's like, okay, I have to hold 415 to 420 for 4 minutes. And that would basically be how he executed that workout?
Exactly. So I do the maths for him. So I know I want 108 to 112. So I will do the maths on a little calculator that I have. And, okay, you're going to do 400 to 420. I'm just throwing numbers out now. 400 to 420 as your average. So what I like the athlete to do, not worry about keeping power, you can't go over 420. You can't go below 400 instantaneously. No, what's the lap average? And if the lap average falls in that, we're golden.
Okay. And then when your athlete is running along, will his power, will it look pretty steady, like 415, 416, 414, or would it like jump around? Because I know on a bike, when you just stand up for a sec, like it shoots up all of a sudden. So what would happen with the numbers he would see on his watch? Yes,
it's going to jump around because human power is stochastic is the word. It's jumpy. It's going to look like a little bumpy line, but if you looked at it, if you looked like 5 minutes worth of bumpy lines, it's straight across, right? Mm-hmm. That's the average for that lap. Most watches have some kind of smoothing function, whether it's 3 seconds or 10 seconds. So people aren't. A lot of people are new to power. They run it on instant power and it's jumping all over. What am I doing? Slow down. No, just put it on like a 3 second smoothing, or if it's a longer interval, 10-second smoothing, and lap power, and just make sure that you're sort of keeping it right in that the average for that lap is staying into those upper and lower zones, so to speak.
Cool. Okay, I think that gives people a good. I think it's one of these things where it's like 1,000 miles deep, right? We could keep going, but I wanted to give a good overview and more an introduction for me and for the listener. So I think that does a pretty good job of establishing what the benefits of using power are and how you might use it. You'd have to figure out, do a little research, determine your critical power, then how you're going to work out what kind of workouts you're going to do, and then how you would move your old workouts into basing them on percentages of your critical power. So I can imagine I could do all of that based off what we just talked about with a little bit of work. Now, if it comes to someone's interested in getting into power, I've noticed it's cropping up on watches, and I've seen more people wearing the pods on their feet. Like, what are the different devices that measure power? And are there some that are better than others that you would recommend, and others that you maybe people should avoid or not trust?
I prefer my athletes use Stride, and we can talk about why. But other devices, Garmin has power that comes from either the chest rate strap, heart rate strap, or wrist base. Garmin power. Coros has wrist-based power. They're getting out of power. They want to try to do a normalized graded pace, but make that it's normalized to a lot of different variables. But Coros still has power. Polar has power. Apple is jumped into the power market.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah. So and then RunScribe was another one that was originally in power and got out of power, from what I recall. So there's about 5 or 6 of them. Now, one you mentioned wrist versus pod.
And then there's chest strap as well, because Garmin.
Chest strap.
So you can get 3 places you could get it from.
Exactly. So wrist-based power typically uses GPS as the source for speed and acceleration. That's problematic if you go in a big city with tall buildings, or you're going in a forest, or you want to run on a treadmill. So those are considerations for listeners that want to consider getting into power. Is it wrist-based? Wrist-based is going to be limited by those factors. Then let's come back to Stride. Why do I use Stride? Stride has been side-by-side comparison in the research, and there's been a number of studies that show Stride superior to Garmin Power, to Polar, and to RunScribe in terms of consistency. I use the statistical term is reliability, meaning test, or run. It's going to be the same thing. If it's the same effort, it's the same power recorded. Mm-hmm. So it's been shown to be superior to those others. It's been shown to be superior in terms of correlation with VO2. So as power increases, VO2. They're all pretty good, but for example, correlation for side-by-side study, correlation for Stride was like 0.86 correlation with VO2 or higher. While Garmin was 0.69, I believe.
Right, okay.
It was lower, the correlation was lower. Still, 6.9 is good, but all the studies that I've seen, Stride comes out on top. In terms of and Stride is the only one that has true wind detection or air power component. So that's the one I prefer. But that said, if someone's got a Garmin Power, whether it's chest strap or wrists or Apple Power, you could still train by power. These same concepts. You still are going to measure critical power. Or you go off your 10K power or whatever, you're still going to have an anchor point, and everything relates back to that.
Yeah,
so
I was thinking
use the same device.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah, like you could use it on the same person with the same device, but you couldn't then compare someone like you using, let's say, a Stride and I wear an Apple Watch, and you couldn't really compare our numbers in any meaningful way, but you could, within one person, if they were always using an Apple Watch, they could work out their critical power and use percentages of that for their training, and it would be maybe not like Olympic level perfect. Maybe then they'd have to invest in something like Stride, but it's good enough to add some more information to their training.
Bingo. And
Okay.
I'm going to Apple, Coros, Stride are all very similar in terms of their power. If you do side by side or DC Raymaker sort of thing, they're all very, very close. Garmin power is about 25-30% higher. The difference is because of the algorithms they use. Like Stride subtracts out the elastic component of running gait. When we run, we land. There's elastic deformation and then elastic recoil as we propel. So that's like, if you're measuring that, then power is going to be higher. Garmin includes that. Stride does not, because Stride wants to extract that. That doesn't have any metabolic cost per se.
Yes, yeah.
And the Stride wanted to get closer to metabolic power, and evidently Apple and Quora sort of followed suit because their powers are pretty close.
I have so many questions about that in terms of running technique and other little nuance that I want to dig into, but we're running short on time and we're coming up to our hour, so we'll have to, I think, would you be able to come back and do a 202 episode sometime in the future? We could get a little bit more into the nitty gritty of it.
I would love to do that. One topic that we talked about, how power helps define training intensities. And that's that's the primary use of power, right? But power also is great at defining training load. And we talked at the very outset of injury prevention and how power and monitoring and managing training load can have a carryover in terms of preventing injury, avoiding training load errors. I'd love to talk with you about that.
Yes, yeah, because I was thinking, I was saying about the power, to my mind, is measuring things a little closer to the source, like around the muscle, generating the force rather than measuring the heart's response. And I was like, well, if you took that information and put that into things like training peaks to see your training stress balance, your fatigue scores and stuff like that, you'd be getting a better sense of how the legs particularly are coping, for runners specifically, as opposed to, people don't get heart injuries, they get leg injuries. So it's interesting to think how it might be used to shine a bit of more of a light on injury risk factors and training errors.
I tell people when they're getting into power, I says, it's not just about training intensities, it's about managing training load. And that is the second biggest advantage of running with power for me in managing and coaching athletes.
So yeah, I want to ask more about technique, training load, and I'll put it in the show notes. Actually, you did an episode, I think it was a while back, with that triathlon show, and you were talking about why you put certain power zones the way you put them, and that was fascinating. I'll put that in the show for people to check out. I think it was that triathlon show. I'll find it.
We talked about that.
Yeah, that was really interesting, but definitely another big can of worms that we are not going to have time for today.
Another
Thank
time.
you, Steve.
I'm really willing, and thank you.
That was fascinating stuff, and a really nice introduction to power for everyone. If anyone wants to learn more about your work, about your work with power, and maybe connect with you and follow your stuff, where should they go?
The best place is the Facebook group. It's called Palladino Power Project Facebook group, and we try to keep it educational. There's a lot of training questions, but there's also concepts that we talk about as well, and I'll throw in some articles and relate them to power. Join us over on Palladino Power Project Facebook group.
Cool. I'll put a link in the description to that. And thank you so much for your time today, Steve. That was excellent.
My pleasure.